Perfect. Welcome, everyone. I'm Robert Berend, and today is April 14th, 2021, and we're here for a 2-hour or so class covering the music, the influence, the life and times of Jimi Hendrix. Background on me before we introduce our special guest. I was born in LA and grew up as a preteen listening to rock and roll before the Beatles started. First song I heard on the radio was Tobacco Road by the Nashville Teens. So I grew up listening to what was underground AM, which was KFWB, and underground FM like KMET. I taught a class a few months ago on the Firesign Theater, and I interviewed the 2 surviving members. That's up on YouTube. I'll be doing a class in a few weeks on the Grateful Dead. That'll also be going up to YouTube. And I've got too much to say, and for some of you will be overwhelmed with information or names or obscurities, and some of you will go, I wish you were delving into this stuff more, like why weren't there Black teenagers on American Bandstand? So a pleasure, and here we go to talk about Jimi Hendrix. Our special guest today to start off the first 30 minutes or so is Jim DeRogatis, who teaches music, and he will introduce himself. He also has an NPR program called Sound Opinions. And with that, Jim DeRogatis, take it away, sir. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Sure, it's my pleasure. It's always fun to talk about Hendrix. I am coming from a different perspective, I think, than you. I am a Gen Xer, okay? So my critical aesthetic is shaped by punk rock and not by the 60s being the end all and be all. I mean, you know, I know you taught a class on Woodstock. I've watched that fucking movie, Robert. It's boring as hell. You know, a lot of hippies rolling in the mud, listening to Richie Havens strumming an acoustic guitar. Listen, brother, I've been to raves in the woods of Hickston, Wisconsin. The drugs were better, the sex was better, and Aphex Twin was playing. So the hell with Woodstock. Now, so I come from the Nirvana generation, essentially. And I think one of the impediments, I will share my screen, and what I want to talk about with Hendrix is I think people get him wrong. I think what is lauded about Hendrix in the popular consciousness is a brilliant guitar player versus what I think should be lauded, which is that he was an amazing synthesist of all of the strains of Black music into something completely innovative and new, which has yet to really be followed up, aside from a few exceptions here and there. The possibilities that Hendrix charted during his short, tragically short life and brilliant career, still all of the strains haven't been picked up. John Morthland was one of the founding editors of Rolling Stone. And in the 70s, they put out one of those big fat books of Rolling Stone history of rock. And I think he nailed what the problem was. Hendrix was seen as the flower generation's electric N-word dandy. It's king stud, golden calf. It's maker of mighty dope music. Its most outrageously visible force. Super spade in the argot of the day. Though his music still sounds resonant today, even his most faddish stuff somehow, his image remains a troubling one. For Hendrix was a revolutionary musician, perhaps the only one in the end to come out of the whole mid-60s psychedelic explosion. Yet this has often been obscured, both by the rather degrading image and by the freakishly flamboyant veneer that helped make his art so popular. So I think you are forgiven if you are post Woodstock generation, post Hendrix, for only seeing this narrow slice of what has been preserved of him in the rock canon. Morthland was saying that, and he, founding editor of Rolling Stone. Robert Christgau said something even more insulting. Christgau, probably the preeminent critic of the baby boom generation, described Hendrix as a psychedelic Uncle Tom. Painting him painting me anyway, but I can see how people get Hendrix wrong. It's all about the guitar hero, the guy who could play a lot of tasty licks, hero of every clerk with no life who is working at Guitar Center. And of course, he set his guitar on fire. Okay. All of this, as Charles Shaar Murray said, the authorized version of the Jimi Hendrix experience, sick, is that Hendrix was a crazy black man who did funny things with the guitar, had thousands of women, eventually died of drugs, which was a shame because he was a really good guitarist and he could play it with his teeth. Hendrix was a composer and a lyricist of considerable gifts, but his songwriting talents have been largely overshadowed by his achievements as a showman and an instrumentalist. Charles Shaar Murray is an Englishman partly of African descent. He is younger than those baby boom critics, both Morthland and Christgau and the others I mentioned. He wrote what I think is the definitive appreciation of Hendrix's artistry, Crosstown Traffic. It's a book I highly recommend. And Charles, being of the punk generation, not quite as young as me, but not as old as Morthland or Christgau, I think he saw the importance of Hendrix, again, as a composer and a lyricist, not just the guy who, set his guitar, a guitar hero, and set his guitar on fire, all of this stuff. What did he actually accomplish and what did he give to the rock canon? I just wanted to chart a little bit of these strains of different Black music that he brought to a new plane. Born and raised in Seattle, right? Fascinated with the guitar from early on. He was a journeyman. He was the youngster serving as a sideman in several really hugely influential soul bands. The Isley Brothers, you may have heard of that. He played with Little Richard. All right. There they are together. And Curtis Knight. The Little Richard recordings, the Isleys, a lot of times some things float out there and you can't really take it that they are actually Hendrix on guitar. But these are recordings here. I want to play you just a little bit of one of hold on, pause, Hendrix playing with Curtis Knight. And you can hear the soul, you can hear the blues grit. Curtis Knight, of course, probably best known by many people as the guy who sings Shout, in the Blues Brothers, not the Blues Brothers, Animal House, right? He's the frat band guy in Animal House. That is Hendrix bringing a fairly ferocious surf guitar to Curtis's rather old school soul review, which I just love. And, we don't think of him in steeped in soul, and we should. We also do not think of him steeped in gospel. Grew up in the Black church, adored the voice of Mahalia Jackson there on the right, the godmother, probably the key female voice of gospel music throughout the 50s and the 60s. Mahalia was sitting on the podium behind Dr. King when he gave the I Have a Dream speech. In fact, King was going down in flames. He was nervous about speaking to such a large audience. Mahalia had sung, introduces King. King has a written text, which was rare for him. And he's losing the crowd. He's sticking to the text. And he made an offhand remark about I Have a Dream. And you can hear Mahalia every King Day when they show the video and audio of that speech say, testify, tell us about that dream, Martin. And that's when he goes off script and gives one of the greatest speeches of all time. Hendrix loved gospel. He incorporated it into some of his music. On the left, we see the Sweet Impressions. The lead voice of that gospel quartet is Cissy Houston, Whitney Houston's mother. All right. It is not ultra prominent. You got to listen with the headphones to hear. But here at the end of Burning of the Midnight Lamp, Burning of the Midnight Lamp from Electric Lady and Land, studio album #3. You can hear the sweet impressions there, at least if your speakers are any good. It's way better to crank it at home on a good home stereo system. Gospel, soul, the blues. Hendrix loved Howlin' Wolf in particular. Hendrix played with Wilson Pickett. All American music comes from the blues, including gospel. Gospel music is essentially given its template in the 40s and the 50s here in Chicago by the Reverend Thomas Dorsey, who had started out as a blues man. Georgia Red, right? His son and his wife died in childbirth, and he found God, and he becomes an entrepreneur, the first great Black music entrepreneur, a publishing company, a label, publishes more than 100 songs, right, that lay the foundation of modern gospel. Anyway, Wilson Pickett also hired young Jimi as a sideman, and we can hear the blues. Certainly, it's probably the most obvious influence in Hendrix's recordings, more obvious than gospel, sweet impressions buried at the end there. The soul, I suppose. I think in something like Red House, you can hear the influence of Muddy Waters. You can hear the influence of Howlin' Wolf. He, in turn, when Hendrix exploded after the first album, was paid tribute by those two. Muddy Waters, still a relatively young man, is overshadowed by the British invasion, the explosion of psychedelic music and 60s rock and roll. And, Muddy is not done yet. He still has things to say. He makes an album called Electric Mud, which is if Hendrix psychedelicized Muddy's lead guitar, then Muddy said, I can do that Hendrix thing too. For that matter, Howlin' Wolf's new album, also Howlin' Wolf perceived as taking a page from the electric guitarists, not the British ones, not Clapton, not Beck, but Hendrix. With Hendrix, they heard something that they really related to. And so Hendrix took from the blues, he gave back to the blues. He also took from free jazz, a trio of huge influences on Jimi: John Coltrane, Ornette Coleman, Roland Kirk. Not the traditional jazz, although, one could argue there's no blues without Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong and the blues both develop at the same time. But the stuff that is happening in the avant-garde, way out there on the fringe, and again, you can hear that, I think, if you listen. Third Stone from the Sun, Kirk in particular, was always dedicated to never making his horn sound like a horn. I think you can hear Hendrix doing the same thing there, with those weird squeaking, squawking tones on the guitar at the beginning of Third Stone from the Sun. All right, so he didn't develop in a vacuum. He influenced these art forms. Of course, in the jazz world, it is said that Miles, with Ad Harta and the trio of electrified albums, Miles Davis is picking up where Hendrix left off. Also, really important, I think, to remember is that there is so much crap sold under the Hendrix name. We forget that in his lifetime, he only had control of the artistic vision of 3 studio albums, right? Are You Experienced, Axis Bold as Love, and Electric Ladyland, and part of Band of Gypsies, the live album, which isn't very good. The part that is very good is Machine Gun, which was his pride and joy. It's debatable how much of that was already chosen and sequenced before his death. So we have a tiny uh, recorded canon, recorded legacy that Jimi actually chose to put out under his own name. I think each of those 3 studio albums is brilliant. And then we have all of this other stuff. This is not to say that there aren't live moments of brilliance. I certainly think his version of the Star Spangled Banner, I dissed Woodstock earlier. Sorry, Robert. There's a lot of bad stuff. And there's a lot of good stuff that got left out. Incredible String Band. How come they didn't make the movie? Okay. But the Star Spangled Banner is obviously amazing. You can hear the sounds of the bombs dropping on Vietnam and Cambodia in Hendrix's guitar, and the layers of resonance of a Black man descended from slavery playing our national anthem, which is, of course, written in the middle of wartime in 1812, and him bringing it to Vietnam in the 60s. All right, brilliant moments live, but not always in control. We have to remember he was limited by the technology. Sound systems were very primitive. He was stoned a lot. People expected the showmanship, the guitar playing with his teeth, the setting the guitar on fire, more than they were willing to let him have a 20-minute free jazz excursion on Third Stone from the Sun, or songs like that. I think that had he lived, he would have been fearless eventually in not playing to people's expectations, and to exploring all of those strains and further synthesizing them even more than he did on his 3 studio albums. But he didn't get the chance. And as a result, his history, his legacy, his accomplishments are defined by people who I think don't often bother to listen to what he really accomplished. Murray made the point earlier that he was a great lyricist, a great melody writer, a great composer. And I think if you listen to songs like Manic Depression and Purple Haze and Spanish Castle Magic, Rainy Day Dream Away, 1983, they do not exist only as showcases for Hendrix's solos. He is composing a song, and there are many great covers that I think illuminate how great those songs were, from sitting down with an acoustic guitar to playing them in completely different genres, that illustrate that the songs stand up. It wasn't just the flash. That's a great picture of Hendrix as a songwriter, I think, sitting there, studying with his upside down guitar and his flower, his lyrics, and thinking hard about them. I think you can hear it again. Guitar leading the melody there. You hear, Hendrix's Flights of Imagination following a dragonfly. I think that without the showmanship, it is still a brilliant song. And then we have to deal with the psychedelic elephant in the room. Turn on Your Mind, Robert plugged that book very kindly earlier. I probably talked to 300 or 400 musicians in the psychedelic genre, which I define very broadly. It did not begin during the Summer of Love. It began in the 50s and 60s when the surf musicians, among others, began to tune in, turn on, drop out. The first mention of LSD 2.5 on a record was the B-side of a surf single, by the Gamblers, a band that would include future Beach Boys sidemen. The psychedelic experience as many musicians as I interviewed said I needed to take the drugs in order to achieve that consciousness and make the music I did. Uh, just as many, it was split, literally 50-50, said, I never took the drugs. To me, it was an awareness of creating an alternate world in the recording studio that existed only in the space between the headphones. It was a freedom to create with sound that may have come from some people taking drugs, but I never did. Hendrix took drugs, no doubt about it. There's my favorite stoned Jimi. That's about as stoned as a human being gets. You can just tell. Hendrix took drugs, but he rejected the psychedelic label. It's a mixture of rock, blues, and jazz, a music that's still developing, that's just now coming, a music of the future. We just happen to be playing freak out and psychedelic things, but it bothers us because psychedelic only means mind expansion anyway. He's absolutely right there. When Humphrey Osmond, the psychedelic pioneer in Canada, psychiatrist who was experimenting with LSD as a treatment for chronic alcoholics, people who were at death's door and having amazing results, was corresponding with Aldous Huxley, the British psychedelic author and psychedelic pioneer, of Brave New World and The Doors of Perception, right? They were trying to come up with a name for these drugs that they were experimenting with clinically and in artistic settings. And they came up with psychedelic from the Greek roots of psyche, mind, and delios, expansion or revealing, mind revealing or mind expanding. Right? Jimi knew this. Jimi understood this. Jimi was one of not the dabblers in psychedelia as a fun, good time high, but as a shortcut to a religious experience, a sort of transcendence of the everyday and a communion with the universe that he called the electric church. All right. He was a philosopher as well as a musician. He was a thinker. He was a reader. He was a musical historian. And then he got stoned. So that's what I wanted to set up a little bit of I think the things that get missed in Hendrix. I say this as a college teacher, and it bothers me when I have students in my class in their 20s and, that boring shit. Well, yeah, if all you are looking at is the guy on Guitar Hero, if all you are looking at is the guy who set a guitar on fire, the Woodstock movie performance or whatever, then you're missing a hell of a lot in Hendrix's legacy. That's my thesis, and I'm sticking to it. So that's what I had prepared. Yeah, similar to Bob Marley, absolutely true. Bob Marley, the amount, Robert, of thick-headed white kids from the suburbs in the dorm room hanging the Marley poster, not understanding, what marijuana, ganja meant to the Rastafarian religion, not understanding a song like Buffalo Soldier, about the Black Americans being sent out to exterminate the red Americans, all for the interest of imperialism and slavery. Hey, when Sinead O'Connor tore up a picture of the Pope on Saturday Night Live and won the enmity of everyone, right? She had just performed an a cappella Marley song. A tenet of the Rastafarian religion is that the Catholic Church condoned, sometimes actively and sometimes passively, slavery. And she was making a statement, and that women in Ireland were slaves as well, not free to control their bodies. And these nuances are the things that I love to point out as a music critic that often get left out. It wasn't cheap outrage. It was never cheap shock outrage with Hendrix either. you got to remember, again, he was a sideman for Little Richard. Little Richard, never set a guitar on fire, but that's because he didn't play guitar. Little Richard was as flamboyant and out and as big a showman as could possibly be imagined in 50s America. And, I'm certain that Hendrix took cues from that, just as he did Oscar Wilde. Part of the Velvet outfits was, he was a reader of and student of Oscar Wilde and Wilde's asceticism philosophy. And, again, so, when Morflin said the electric N-word dandy, not a phrase we'd use today, but 1980 in Rolling Stone is pretty late. Yeah, there was a public caricature that I think was skin deep, superficial, as deep as his velvet jacket.
Thank you, Jim. Back to Marley for 1 second. My friend Roger Steffens, who has written and lectured about Bob Marley all over the world and helped bring reggae to America. He had an NPR show called The Reggae Beat for maybe 20, 25 years. What I learned from many years of listening to reggae, that the Rastas consider marijuana a sacrament. So it's a real religious thing, right? Which many people don't know. And a lot of reggae songs have to do with oppression, like Get Up, Stand Up. And religion is also a huge part of the reggae canon. I think it's like 1/4 of the songs are on drugs, 1/4 is on oppression, 1/4 is on religion, and 1/4 on love. There you go. And that's pretty much all of the reggae topics.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. Do we have any quick questions from people for Jim while he's here? You can unmute yourself if you got a question or two for Jim.
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to thank you so much. It was excellent. He was an amazing man. I know more about him than I ever did. I didn't realize that he played with Little Richard and all of those people. So that's a big plus. So thank you so much for your talk.
Sure. Thank you for saying that.
In my readings, and I have been immersing myself in Hendrix since January when they told me I'll be doing this class. I've probably gone through 7 books on Hendrix, and I have found errors and misinformation, which is cool.
Yeah.
Like Gypsy Sons and Rainbows. One book says S-O-N, but the Jimi Hendrix website says S-U-N. It's interesting. But he did meet Little Richard when he was like 8 years old. Little Richard pulled up in a neighbor's driveway because he was apparently also from Seattle or visiting friends. But that Hendrix took his mustache and his flamboyancy from Little Richard directly.
There you go.
That's why all the poopy.
Have you read Charles Shaar Murray's book, Robert?
This one here.
There you go. Brilliant book.
I have several others in arm's reach.
Yeah.
Yes, and when I'm done with this, I'll be jumping into the Pacific Ocean of Grateful Dead universe. But then I only have 50 years to cover, not 27. Just 50.
There you go. Yeah, and their legacy is a lot longer and harder to parse.
And it's in small print. Anyone else have any questions or want to thank Jim for being awesome and being here? David.
Jim, what are the courses that you teach in college? What are some of the subject or topics that you cover, that you teach?
Every spring I have 3 writing courses. 2 writing courses and a reading course. Reviewing the arts and cultural criticism in the arts. So criticism and journalism as literature. This notion that you can be a journalist and tell real stories, not fiction, but use the techniques of the novelist or the short story writer. That's an idea, of course. We start with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, and we end with Susan Orlean's Orchid Thief, and it encompasses Hunter Thompson and many great writers, George Plimpton and Joan Didion, and then up to the current day practitioners. Susan Orlean's a hero of mine. And then I have this, I got roped into, at Columbia College, Chicago, all the incoming freshmen have to take an introductory course to Chicago, architecture in Chicago, civil rights in Chicago. I teach music and media in Chicago. as a journalist and as a music critic. We look at the roots of gospel and the roots of the blues, and all the way up to Chicago hip hop and Kanye West, and also the media strain. I figured, well, okay, I've been writing about music my whole life. I'm in the media. I mean, the Chicago tradition of journalism. It was a privilege that I worked for 15 years. Besides Roger Ebert, he did movies, I did music at the Sun-Times, and the front page. This is a newspaper town. It's a newspaper town where one newspaper, we have two left. The Sun-Times is on life support at death's door, and the Tribune is about to be sold to Alden Global Capital, which is an investment firm that comes in and picks the bones dry and then shutters. So it's entirely possible that one of the greatest cities in America is soon going to have no newspapers. And it's a sad time, which is why I teach, you see.
Thank you, Jim. Jeff?
Jeffrey, yeah.
There are a couple of things. First of all, there's a great article, an interesting article in today's New York Times about wealthy individuals buying newspapers as a way of.
Yeah, well, but the news today was that this Swiss billionaire who's on the left and was going to buy the Tribune, the board of directors at the Tribune is rejecting his bid, even though it's more money than this Alden Global Capital.
Is that because
that wants to just gut the place? It's Twitter in Chicago is exploding. Every journalist is pulling her hair out.
Yeah. All right. So first of all, I want to just, in terms of the rules of this this whole experience, do we let people into this who have Yankees caps on, even if they're in a language that not everybody understands? But that's a joke.
Yeah.
Baruch Hashem.
Baruch Hashem, right. My question was, how old was Hendrix, and how long did he play with any of these folks like the Isley Brothers or Little Richard or Curtis Knight? Were these short gigs or were they longer?
Jim, I will be getting into that when it's my turn.
Yeah. Well, you're fresher with it, having read those 12 books. Yeah, but he was in his teens essentially, right? He was a kid.
He died at 27.
Yeah.
5 days younger than me.
So yeah, he was, but what an education, right? I mean, just those pictures I showed, Isley's, Curtis Knight, is extraordinary to think. I mean, he learned at the hands of masters. And I just love the idea that he also gave back. The fact that you have Muddy, I love Electric Mud. Some people hate it and say it's not a Muddy Waters album. It's like, hey, Muddy made the album he wanted to. What are you talking about? It's not a Muddy Waters album. I think the same thing with Howlin' Wolf's new album. There is a dialogue happening between these two generations of groundbreaking Black guitarists that can't be denied.
I think Wolf said he didn't like the Electric album, that they, like the advertising said, from a guy who didn't want to pick up an electric guitar, and Wolf said, what the hell are you talking about? I've been playing electric before you guys ever showed up. But Mark,
yeah. Well, it's fun. I also have talked to people who played with him who said, you never got him to do anything he didn't want to do.
I was just
fucking Howling Wolf. It's a scary man.
Before I forget, I want to say that in '72, I saw Alice Cooper at the Hollywood Palladium, and Howlin' Wolf opened for Alice Cooper.
Oh, that's very cool.
So let's take the last question, and then I'll present, since I've. Sweet, please go right ahead and keep it short, and then we'll go on to me. Sweet, you had a question?
Well, I had some comments about Hendrix. There really was no one like him. Anything that I'd seen somebody else do, he could do it and do it better. And I saw him twice back in the day. First time was in Seattle, and his parents were there, so he tuned it down. But the next time I saw him was in Kansas City, and he pulled out all the stops. He ended up at the end of the show taking his guitar off, throwing it way up in the air, and walked off stage.
Well, that's bragging rights. Seeing Hendrix twice. I was that's cool. I was 5.
I'm sorry you couldn't have gotten in.
Yeah. All right.
All is well.
Well, thank you for the invite, Robert. I
My
appreciate it.
pleasure. So Jim, when I'm next in Chicago, I'll take you out for pizza if that's okay, or see you on Jam Cruise or the Blues Cruise, perhaps. Or
I don't
not.
know when I'm getting on. I don't know about that, but
Yeah.
you know, and hey, I grew up in New York. This Chicago pizza is not as good. It is not as good as New York.
I owe you a favor. So
Pizza Wars, Pizza
Coast to
Wars.
Europe.
if you need a Hendrix expert or a dead expert in 2 weeks, I'm available. Thank you, Jim,
Okay.
for being here.
Take care.
A pleasure, sir. Thank you so much.
Very, very much.
All right. Now, that was awesome. That was really superb. Thank you, Jim DeRogatis. And now, me, Robert Berend. And I'm wearing my Jimi Hendrix shirt just for everyone to see that I have occasion to wear this awesome shirt. And let us begin with my part of the program. So that was really kind of him. We went on for like 40 minutes with Jim DeRogatis. And now we've got me for another hour 20. And if we go over, that is fine. I'm here for the duration. And thanks all for your attention and the great questions. Where to start? I have a ton of stuff and embellishments on what Jim had, everything from Jimmy's birth to death and where he would have gone had he been here. So any questions before I get going? And if not, that is superb. So I've got copious notes to trigger my conversations. So indeed, Jimmy did refer to his music as electric church music. When he played, it was his inspiration. It's what he did. The music flowed through him. Jimmy's dad was Al Hendrix, who was born in 1919 in Vancouver, Canada. And he was a really good dancer. That was sort of his claim to fame. So he had a huge interest in music. And while he was doing his dancing, he met a woman named Lucille Jeter, who was born in 1925. And they connected and they had Jimi Hendrix. So Jimmy's original birth name, just for the record, so everybody knows, because I'm making this as comprehensive as I can, was born Johnny Allen Hendrix. And Al wasn't really a fan of that name. So a few years later, when Jimmy was about 4 years old, it got changed to James Marshall Hendrix. Jimmy was 1/16 Cherokee. His paternal grandmother was Cherokee and lived also in Canada. In his early years, Jimmy spent about 2 years living, off and on living in Canada with his grandmother, and those were some of the best times that he had, along with an aunt who also lived there. When Jimmy was born in late 1942, Al had to go off to the army. So Jimmy did not meet his father till he was 3 years old. His mother, Lucille Jeter, was, according to the numerous books I have plowed through, basically an alcoholic and a good time girl who was into dancing and partying and drinking and was not really a big fan of raising Jimmy because it interfered with her party side. So when Al was in the army, his first year of checks, for some reason, to help support Jimmy, never arrived. So living in absolutely hard time, destitute poverty, Lucille would let Jimmy stay with other friends, with relatives, with strangers. Basically, Jimmy was in foster care for the first 3 years. When he got back from the army, Al found out that Jimmy was in Berkeley with a non-relative, just, Aunt Mary, or whoever she was called. And Al went down from Seattle, where Jimmy was born, down to Berkeley and picked up Jimmy at age 3 and said, look, I have the papers, I'm the dad. And with that, they got on the train and went back to Seattle. They eventually got divorced, and even before they got divorced, which was several years later, she'd be gone for days. And so Jimmy had a very, very tough life and a poverty life. when he got back with Al from age 3, Al was really strict. Al didn't really have any skills. He worked sometimes in landscaping, but he was busy raising Jimmy. 6 years later, in 1948, Jimmy's younger brother Leon was born, so 6 years younger. They just had a hard time, and it's hard to express how hard a time they had to not even make ends meet. And this continued until Jimmy went off to London with Chaz Chandler from the Animals, who was going to make him famous, and did, on September 24th, 1966. But Jimmy had a hard life all the way through, and that was formative in his life. In England, people like Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck in the 60s were playing the blues, but Clapton said he and Jeff Beck would wonder, what would it be like to be like a black blues musician and have a Corvette that smelled of sex and smelled of drugs and have that kind of lifestyle? Well, Jimmy and Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf had the poverty lifestyle to really live the blues. Jimmy was taken to church as a kid, as Jim DeRogatis said, but he was kicked out of church because of ratty clothes, and he was made fun of because the clothes and all that were just so poverty stricken. So once he was kicked out of church as a kid, he never returned. Again, in 1950 to 52, so he was 8 to 10 years old, he was living with his aunt in Vancouver. And he learned a lot about Indian culture and how Indians had been treated by the Americans and by the whites from his maternal grandmother, and also those were some of the happiest years of his life. In 1957, so he was about 15 years old, he met Little Richard, who was visiting one of the neighbors. For some reason, he got to meet Little Richard as a kid. He also saw Elvis when he was 15 years old, and that's the same year that he got a $5 guitar. As a kid, he used to play a broom pretending he was playing guitar, and so his dad could see he really, really had a desire to play guitar. And one night, and the story varies between, he either said, I'll buy that $5 guitar for my friend, or he was yelled at to buy the guitar for Jimmy. But either way, he did. So in high school, and Jimmy dropped out of high school, he was in a band called the Rockin' Kings. When his mother died at age 15, his dad, Al, said, you're not going to the funeral. So neither he or Leon went to the funeral. And the dad said, boys don't, men don't cry, gave them a shot of, I think it was Chivas or Jack Daniels or something like that, and said, have a drink, you're not going to the funeral. Sorry, the mother was 16, so died in 1958. I even read conflicting things about the year of death. So his mother, Lucille, died. And from her, in the song Angel, that's dedicated to his mother. And in Castles Made of Sand, which we will get to, I've got videos and audios, and I did send all of you the lyrics to about a half dozen or so songs. Castles Made of Sand, which I think is the most emotional and well-written Jimi Hendrix song of all of them. And I've been a fan of Jimi Hendrix since he came on the radio in the 60s when I was a kid. I think Castles Made of Sand is the most emotional song. We will get to playing that later. There's in the third verse, she drove her wheelchair to the end of the shore, to the edge of the shore, and to her legs she smelled, you won't hurt me no more. The last time Jimmy saw his mother, she was in a wheelchair. So while he was a teenager, he was arrested twice for joyriding in stolen cars, and sort of given the choice of you can go to jail or you can go to the army. So in January 1962, Jimmy went to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and joined the 101st Army Division paratroopers. He had his dad send him his guitar, and he would sleep with his guitar, and he would play with his guitar all day. And because he was the weird guy that slept with his guitar, he was beaten up. The other soldiers would sometimes steal his guitar, and he would get on his knees and cry and beg for his guitar. In high school, he was called Marbles because it was as if he had marbles in his mouth, because he was really shy and very introverted and very polite, no doubt being raised by a very strict father. So when you see how Jimmy grew until he died at 27, these are some of the key influences on on how he was as a grown-up. And we'll see the Dick Cavett interview, and you will see he's very shy and reserved. He was flamboyant when he was on stage with the guitar to speak what was in his head. So in high school, he was in a band called the Rockin' Kings, and 62 went to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, like I said, and he did 26 jumps, which got him his wings, and he injured his ankle. Some of the books say he injured his back, but I saw one of countless documentaries where in his own voice he's saying, I told them I injured my back so I could get out of it. So Jimi and the Army were happy to say goodbye to each other. One of the captains, for example, whatever rank, said, wanted Jimi to go for a psychiatric eval. Jimi said no. At any rate, they soon parted ways. He stayed in the area of Kentucky and Tennessee, and started playing, locally. Was in the Memphis area. While he was still in the military, he was playing with another band that he had started called the King Casuals, and Billy Cox, back in November 1961, so, well, or give or take, some of the dates do vary. He met Billy Cox, who played bass, and Billy came from was an African-American as well. And Billy came from a musically trained family, and he knew how to play bass. So with Billy, who stayed with Jimi till the end, Billy Cox played with Jimi at Woodstock and New Year's Eve and New Year's Day at the Fillmore Auditorium, the fourth album of the Band of Gypsies album. And another guy from the military named Larry Lee also played with Jimi and Billy at Woodstock. And just to give a reference for the times of where we're talking about, in 1961, the Freedom Riders went to the South. In 1963 was King's March on Washington. And in 1963, Jimi met up with a woman named Fane Pridgeon, and they got involved in a relationship and were friends through the rest of his life. And Jimi started playing the Chitlin circuit, which, as you probably know, that's where Black musicians would and could play in the South, because that's where they get a hotel room, because segregation was quite alive and well. So as Jim mentioned, he played with a lot of other bands backing them. So here I'm going to interject something that in all my studies and years of being a Hendrix fan, I came across something that hasn't been mentioned in any book. In 1963, a Japanese film, which was released in Japan in 61, but released in America in 63, called Magic Boy, was released. And Jimi was into Flash Gordon. He was into science fiction. He sings about Jupiter's sulfur mines. The movie Magic Boy is a Japanese animated film, and we will get to eventually listening to in the song Train a Comin', he says, gonna be a magic boy. No one but me has shown or said this link to Magic Boy has to do with this highly obscure Japanese anime film. So please put on my tombstone, Robert Berend figured that one out. So that's the reference to Magic Boy. In January 1964, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Apollo Theater in Harlem. So on Wednesdays, they would have a talent night. And if you were bad, you got tomatoes thrown at you and you got the hook. But in January 64, Jimi won amateur night at the Apollo. That's pretty good. The Staple Singers won there, and various other names. I've got many references, but winning the Apollo amateur night was definitely was an impressive thing to do. So 3-4 months later, Jimi was backing the Isley Brothers, and the amount of time he spent with the band varies, because sometimes he would miss the bus, probably because he was with someone else. He couldn't even make it to bed on time in the Army, which is why they also kicked him out. But if you were late, you got fined. If you didn't follow the rules, you were fined. If you misstepped, if you were doing background dancing and you misstepped, you'd be fined. And you weren't making much, so being fined in this gig economy was very common. So he worked for the Isleys as lead guitarist. You might remember their song Summer Breeze from 20-30 years ago. So Jimi, as a kid, was the lead guitarist. He toured with King Curtis, who was a famous saxophone player who performed with the Coasters. he played with Wilson Pickett, and in June of '64, he went on a tour hosted by, not on a tour, he performed at a concert where the DJ Magnificent Montague was leaving his New York station and moving to LA. So I grew up in LA. I used to listen to Magnificent Montague. So now we have a side footnote here, or a footnote. So Magnificent Montague, as a DJ, would, when he's playing singles, he would be shouting into the mic, getting all animated, go, "Burn, baby, burn," because that was his catchphrase for great music. In 1965, there were the Watts riots, and that is also where you heard "Burn, baby, burn." And also with Enron in the movie Smartest Guys in the Room, when the mountains are burning underneath the electrical wires, "Burn, baby, burn." So after the Watts riots, Magnificent Montague changed the expression to "learn, baby, learn," and tried to dissociate himself from that phrase. But that is the etymology of "burn, baby, burn." And as far as I know, he is still alive and well in Palm Springs area. Okay, yeah, so the Watts riots happened in August 1965. They lasted 6 days. I remember watching them on TV. The best song on the Watts riots is by Frank Zappa, called "Trouble Every Day." And then next time there's a riot, which should be in a week or two, because it's America and it's 2021, next time there's a riot, the song "Trouble Every Day" by Zappa should definitely be the background on the news. Okay, so in the Watts riots, six days, 34 people died, and there were 4,000 arrests. So that is the aroma of the times with the Vietnam War beginning. And 1 year later, in '66, there's revolution in the air. So in '66, he's working behind still King Curtis and Wilson Pickett. And in '63 and '64, he's working with Little Richard. And Little Richard, as Jim said, was, and as probably all of you know, Little Richard was really showy and flamboyant and became a preacher and was bisexual and was hitting on Jimi Hendrix and possibly hitting on anything that moved. I really don't know. But Jimmy emulated Little Richard and his style and his flamboyancy and the jumping up on stage. And that is why, for some of the books I've read, that Jimmy was flashy with the ruffled collars and shirts, and we'll get to the videos later. And the mustache is definitely that he has is definitely a Little Richard mustache. So the rock and roll, the R&B music. Little Richard. Little Richard was born in 1932 in Macon, Georgia, the third of 12 children. His dad was a bootlegger who was shot to death. So also that tough life. Regarding the spread of what were called at the time in the 40s, 50s, early 60s, race records, before I believe it was Jerry Wexler came up with the word rhythm and blues, just eased race records out of the terminology and put in R&B, rhythm and blues. I was reading that the mafia was behind the spread of race music, as was called then, because the mafia owned jukeboxes and juke joints. And so once records became a hit in the South and in the black section of town, if a song became a hit, they would slowly move it geographically to the jukeboxes in the more affluent white neighborhoods, because more affluence, more songs sold, more money. And so you can thank the mafia for another good deed. Okay, now in 1964, so another thing that I read at length, and you can just Google this, like racism on American Bandstand, on Dick Clark's American Bandstand. The show started in 1956 as a local program for 2 years, but as they had black stars, but they really didn't have any black kids. And so they said, oh, we'll let black kids in, we're fine with that. We're not in favor of racism, but magically the black kids were never let into dance. So this begat a lot of journalistic hue and cry over why are no black kids there, even though they were in line, just the folks at the TV station saying, you can't go in. So it's a really interesting slice of history that I just learned, a couple days ago doing research for this. So finally in 1964, once American Bandstand moved to Los Angeles, they finally let black kids in. So now it's 1964, and Jimi Hendrix is, AWOL from his bands in Los Angeles. He left Little Richard, or maybe he was fired. Little Richard says he was fired. Hendrix says he didn't get paid for 5 weeks, so he left. But either way, he met Arthur Lee, and Arthur Lee, you might know the band Love. They did the song 7 and 7 Is, and the song My Little Red Book. But apparently prior to the end of his partnership then with Little Richard, because they hooked up again as friends, but as touring buddies, they were playing apparently in a small club in Pasadena with like 30 people, and Dick Dale, hands up for those that know Dick Dale, king of the surf guitar. He had the first surf song in 1961. Dick Dale went to go see Little Richard, because everybody knew Little Richard, and meets up with Jimi Hendrix, and they're talking to each other, and Dick Dale's explaining, teaching him some of his surf licks, so they became friends. So there is in Third Stone from the Sun that Jim played a bit of. The closing line, since all of you got the lyrics there, it's a pretty difficult song to listen to, and we'll be getting to that momentarily. But in Third Stone from the Sun, the closing line is, "And you'll never hear surf music again." And this was Jimmy's homage to Dick Dale, because they found out he had cancer. And so though it was a number of years later, that line, "And you'll never hear surf music again," in Third Stone from the Sun, which refers to the earth, that's a tip of the hat to Dick Dale. Okay, soon we'll be wrapping up. Yeah, okay, let me just go on with this a little bit more. So he met with Arthur Lee of Love and 7 and 7 Is. Briefly, he was playing with Ike and Tina, and also with Sam and Dave. And by the way, I had heard that Sam and Dave hated each other. Like, they'd arrive at a concert separately, they'd leave separately, they'd play together. And according to one source, they did not like each other at all. In April 1965, Hendrix is again with Little Richard in New York, touring under the famed rock and roll star that you all remember, Soupy Sales. Soupy Sales was the headliner on the band because of the mouse, that you all remember that song. Sales fired Little Richard, saying that he was playing over his allotted 20 minutes, and Little Richard's going like, "I'm the star, I need all the time I want," but saying he was overtime and he was showy. And this led to somebody running around in the upper balcony at the Paramount, where they had like a 5-day gig, with a gun, and also a cop had a gun under Little Richard's head, with a few other musicians in the elevator at the Paramount, apparently. Quite an interesting read, and I will email you guys my bibliography. Later on in 65, Hendrix is playing with Joey D, who you remember did the Peppermint Twist. Feel free to twist if you would like. And that summer, in August of 65, Dylan released Like a Rolling Stone, on the album, but Like a Rolling Stone. And Hendrix noticed that Hendrix did not like his own voice. And when he would record in studio, they would put up barriers so he could sing unwatched by others. But he realized in August of 65, spending the rent money on the Dylan album, that if this Dylan guy, who I idolized, because Dylan had already been out for a couple of years, has such a miserably bad voice.
It's true.
Tip of the hat to Rod Stewart and Neil Young with that one, that if Bob Dylan can do it, I can do it. And in fact, Dylan did say about the Jimi Hendrix version of All Along the Watchtower, that Hendrix did it better than Dylan did it. So later on the road, when Dylan was touring with the band, it was the rock and roll version, because Dylan liked Jimmy's version better. In 1965, Jimi is playing in Harlem with feathers and boas, and as it says in one of his songs in If 6 Was 9, letting his freak flag fly. And although he's an African-American man, in Harlem, he was ridiculed, laughed at, people going like, "What's up, is the circus in town?" So he was told, "You might do better in Greenwich Village," because it was hipper, and indeed he did. But still, seriously, because he was 1965 and an unknown guy who'd been backing these people, the more famous bands, he was still skipping out on his rent. He was living in alleys. He was eating ketchup out of ketchup packets and orange peels with roaches and rats crawling over him. That's his own recollection. So that is a miserable upbringing to be having. He then starts a band called Jimi James and the Blue Flames. And he's playing at Cafe Wha, W-H-A question mark, which was a major dive in Greenwich Village. Like it was $1 admission or no admission. And the musicians were not paid much because the owner knew I have 1,000 starving musicians here and they'll play for nothing if they can't get into the bigger venues. And indeed, Jimmy could not because he was a nobody. So the band was then Jimi James and the Blue Flames. And one day Jimmy is in, and we're getting to the music soon. Well, okay, we're doing fine actually. So one day Jimmy's at, I think it was Manny's Music Store, and there's a 15-year-old kid playing guitar, and he watches Jimmy play guitar as he's trying out guitars, and Jimmy sees the 15-year-old being pretty good. And this kid's name was Randy, and he says, well, Randy, why don't you come over to Cafe Wha tonight and join my band? Because Jimmy was like that. And indeed, I mean, bongo players, it seriously would say, come on, bongo player, come join the band. So Jimmy had quite the open door policy. So Randy joined, and eventually in the band, there was this Randy from LA, whose family owned the Ash Grove. And there was another Randy in the band. So this Randy became Randy California. Footnote, Randy California went on with his uncle, Ed Cassidy, to form Spirit. And there were several Spirit albums and several important Spirit songs like Fresh Garbage, Got a Line on You, 1984, and 1984 was banned because it was so political from a number of radio stations. But at 15 years old, Randy California was quite good. And after Spirit broke up, Randy formed his own solo band called Captain Copter and his fabulous Twirly Birds, where they also played some Hendrix and Hendrix-like songs in that album. Okay, so now coming up to the 4 glory years of Hendrix. So Jimmy's living on the street and playing at Cafe Wha as the Flames, the Blue Flames, and a woman named Linda Keith happens to hear him and goes, he's pretty good. Linda Keith is the girlfriend or the girlfriend of Keith Richards, who, as we know, is the lead guitarist for the Rolling Stones. I trust the Rolling Stones need no introduction. So Linda Keith becomes a fan of Jimmy's and a fan. And meanwhile, the Animals, you remember House of the Rising Sun. So in my readings, I see that at one point someone says that House of the Rising Sun was recorded during a lunch break for £5 in an hour. That there is a house in New Orleans that all of you know cut on lunchtime for £5. So that was pretty good, pretty important. So the song Hey Joe was not written, I'm forgetting offhand who wrote it in the midst of all this, but Hey Joe became a popular song by a Los Angeles band called The Leaves. It was released in a slow version by Tim Rose. The Leaves version was pretty rock and roll fast, but the slower Tim Rose version was also pretty popular. So the bass player of the Animals was a guy named Chaz Chandler, and Chaz Chandler knew Linda Keith. Chaz was looking for someone to do a remake of Hey Joe. And surprisingly, Jimi Hendrix was cranking out great versions of Hey Joe, unaware of Chaz. Okay, they did have a cigarette the day that Little Richard had the gun to his head, but let's skip that one time they met because, you know, they didn't connect it. But yet more information when you go through a library. So the Animals were done performing in New York. Linda finds Chaz, says, looking for someone to do Hey Joe, come see this guy. So they meet once. Chaz says, I want to sign you, I want to manage you. He comes back to town a few weeks later, tracks Jimmy down, signs him to manage him, and says, I will make you famous, we will go to England. Jimmy's two questions are, how are the amps? You know, how those giant speakers behind you, how good are your amps? And question number two, can I meet Eric Clapton? Answer to both, amps are great. Yes, you can meet Clapton, I know him. And there they go. At Cafe Wah, because of Linda Keith, some other friends of Linda's came by to visit the unknown Jimi Hendrix, then Jimmy James. And some of the people who stopped by to see him were this guy, Mick Jagger, lead singer of the Stones, Pete Townsend, lead guitarist of The Who, a guy named Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney stopped by with John Lennon to watch Jimi Hendrix in the haven't gone to Europe and become famous days. That's how good Jimi Hendrix was, you know, bubbling at the surface, ready to burst. Quick comment, and then we'll go to the days of Europe, and then we'll also hear some musical interludes. Jimmy used to pawn his guitars because between food and rent and whatever else, he would pawn his guitars very frequently and need to borrow money to get them at a hawk. So Linda Keith lends Jimi Hendrix a Fender Stratocaster, and I'm more than happy to talk for 10 hours about blues and about an hour on Fender Stratocasters if you would like. Stratocasters were Hendrix's guitar of choice. So one day Linda Keith lends Hendrix Keith Richards' personal Stratocaster. This prompted Keith Richards, according to one of the stories, to get a gun, go to Cafe Wah, go after Jimi Hendrix. And also he contacted Linda Keith's dad in England and said, your daughter's hanging out with a black junkie. Why don't you come get her? So Mr. Keith flies in and drags Linda Keith out of the bar. And this is at length in one of the books I'm reading. Drags him out of the club and flies her back to the UK. Let's hear some music, yes? All right. Pardon me? Everybody, I know everybody's muted, but that's cool. We're gonna play a little bit of Hey Joe. So my technical director is here and a little bit of Hey Joe for you. And let's see, the next song we have on the agenda. Oh, sorry, Sweet. Let me unmute you, or actually, if you could unmute yourself, Sweet, yes.
The first people to record Hey Joe was the Surfaris. And what's that?
They did Wipeout.
Yes, they did. Very good. You just went up in my esteem.
I was already really high.
Yeah, well, surf music, that's the music of my people. And also the Byrds recorded it.
And who wrote it?
The Byrds. And
who
then
wrote it, if you have that handy?
Who did the original version was, the guy who wrote it was
not crucial if it's not easily found.
yeah, well, it was
don't worry, we have 45 minutes to go, so
I'll
keep it tight.
I'll call you tonight around midnight. And,
I'll be there. We have
okay.
45 minutes, and you know, to get to the meat of it, and happy to stay late.
I want you to know I've never played Hey Joe in my life.
Nor I. Okay, let's get back to what's the next track we have? And The Wind Cries Mary. This was, so Hey Joe was a famous Hendrix song, and The Wind Cries Mary. So the story behind The Wind Cries Mary, we'll be getting to momentarily, that he gets into England, and his first night there, plays a gig and meets Kathy Mary Etchingham. And eventually they have a fight, and he writes a song, and Kathy's middle name is Mary. And so per the encyclopedias on Hendrix here, the Wind Cries Mary is about Kathy Mary Etchingham. Life cycle. So after signing a contract and meeting for dinner with Chaz Chandler, and they met at the restaurant where earlier on Jimmy had met Bob Dylan. And according to Hendrix, they were both too drunk to remember anything, but they met. So at that same restaurant, That's where the contract is signed, and all is well. And packing, so several of the books say that packing nothing except his guitar and a change of clothes and Valderma face cream. They leave on September 23rd, arriving September 24th, 1966 in London. Stickler that I am, one of the books says that along with the Valderma and the guitar, he also brought a copy of Roland Kirk's LP called R.I.P. Rig and Panic. Just so we're fully up to date on everything that Hendrix ever did or had for breakfast. Arriving 9/24 in London, they go to the home of a musician named Zoot Money. And no doubt most of you don't know Zoot Money, but that's he was a famous musician, not as famous as other people, but people knew that he was a good guy and would stay with him. So living at Zoot Money's house is a young guy named Andy Summers, and Andy Summers grew up to join a band called The Police that you know because you know Sting. There was also a 19-year-old girl living there upstairs named Kathy Etchingham. So Mrs. Zoot Money goes upstairs and says, the wild man of Borneo is here, because in the newspapers, Hendrix was sometimes referred to as the wild man of Borneo. So Kathy says, I'm tired, no big deal, see him some other time. So it turns out that that Hendrix was going to be playing that night. So I'm just trying to imagine, you're jet lagged, you've waited all your life to be famous, you're traveling with one of the Animals, you're going to London, you're going to meet Clapton, you're not sleeping on the plane probably, you land, you go to Zoot Money's, you hang out, you jam, that night you play a gig. That night Kathy Etchingham shows up at the gig and they move in together into a hotel. That's pretty fast, but that's the story as it's relayed to me. 5 days later, with Brian Auger, and a number of you might remember Brian Auger. There's Brian Auger in the Trinity, and he played here about a year and a half ago. I saw him in concert. So Chaz wanted him to play with Brian Auger, and so in fact they were indeed playing together. So now it's 5 days later, September 29th, playing with Brian Auger, and there's a French singer named Johnny Halliday, Halladay, who says to Chaz, does this guy have a band? He's really good, isn't it? Hearing that Johnny Halliday wants to take Jimi to France to play because he doesn't need a work permit to play in France, they set about finding a band for Jimi. So this I find interesting because Jimi had toured now for years with dozens and dozens of bands and knew his chops and knew what it was like to be on the road. So a guitarist comes in to interview with Jimi, and this is Noel Redding. Noel Redding does not know how to play bass guitar. Noel Redding is hired to play bass guitar. So since I'm also going to be teaching soon a course on the Grateful Dead, I found a similar story. When the Dead were forming, they needed a bass player. They meet Phil Lesh, who was trained in music, didn't know how to play bass guitar, and was also hired as the bass guitarist. So Noel Redding, Phil Lesh, both hired to play bass in a band that became world famous. Neither knew how to play a bass. So it goes. The drummer who auditioned, well, several auditioned. One was Mitch Mitchell. Mitch Mitchell had played with Georgie Flame and the Blue Flames. So one other observation I have, that one that neither of those guys knew how to play bass, that's another one of the, aha, Robert pulls it together. But here's another one. When Jimi James and the Blue Flames were playing in New York at Cafe Wah, it was Jimi James and the Blue Flames. Mitch Mitchell's band that he was playing in before he was quick fired, whichever was true, was Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames. So Blue Flames, can't play bass, Magic Boy, thank you. My contribution to rock and roll arcane trivia. So there's another drummer named Ainsley Dunbar, and at least one of you knows that Ainsley Dunbar played with Frank Zappa. Ainsley Dunbar is still around and has performed on countless albums and is an amazing guitar, an amazing drummer. So how was it decided between Ainsley Dunbar, famous well-known drummer, and Mitch Mitchell, who had been in a Ovaltine commercial or something similar and knew how to play drums? The old tried and true method. They flipped a coin and Mitch Mitchell won. And that's how Mitch Mitchell got hired to be the drummer for the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And Noel Redding was hired because Jimmy liked his hair because it was like Jimmy's, big and poofy. That's what it takes. And those are the true stories behind this. So the band is now formed. They spend some time practicing. They go off to France, and 3 weeks later, in mid-October, they're playing in France, England, Germany, and that's the beginning of the Jimi Hendrix Experience. But let's go back to Chaz Chandler. I'd like to meet Eric Clapton. So everybody knew Clapton, and around that time there was graffiti and rumor, and there were buttons saying Clapton is God. So Clapton had played in the Yardbirds, and I can't remember if he played with Alexis Corner or not, but Sean McLaughlin played with Alexis Corner, who, if you're into more earlier 1960-ish British blues, it's a name to know. Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce of Cream and Ginger Baker of Cream also played with Alexis Corner in the old days. The hierarchy and the interlinkings are quite entertaining, and it's trivia for those of you that like it. Some don't, but some do. So I'm making all audiences happy, I trust. So 1 week after he arrived, we're now back to October 1, 1966. Cream is playing at the Polytechnic, which is where Pink Floyd started, I believe, in 1963. And if ever there was a psychedelic band, that would have been Pink Floyd. So because Chaz Chandler knows Eric Clapton, and of course he's now managing Hendrix, Cream is playing one of their very first gigs ever as Cream, and so Hendrix goes on stage, with approval to go play. The first song he plays is "Killing Floor," which is a song by Howlin' Wolf, that 6'6" gentleman we met earlier, and within the first 10 bars of the song, Clapton leaves the stage, having been outdone and outperformed by Jimi Hendrix. Chaz goes to him backstage and says, "Are you all right?" Well, Clapton is apparently trying to light a cigarette like this. And he says, and I quote, "You didn't tell me he was that fucking good." Let's do a segue here to another video. Not to Wild Thing, we're going to jump ahead. So Hendrix was asked to Rory Gallagher. Hendrix was asked here and there, what's it like to be the best guitarist in the world? And Hendrix, as we'll see when we get to the Dick Cavett interview, was a really shy and modest guy, like I said. So when asked, what's it like to be the best guitarist in the world? Hendrix said, "I don't know, ask Rory Gallagher." So maybe two of you know who Rory Gallagher is. I had the honor of seeing Rory Gallagher twice, and this is a little bit of Rory Gallagher doing some blues. This is who Hendrix thought was the best guitarist in the world, Rory Gallagher. Interested in the blues, I have about a dozen Rory Gallagher albums. I would say the Irish Tour 74 is the one to get. I know some of you are not really as into music as I am, because music is probably my first or second favorite hobby or passion. But for those of you wondering, I've never heard of Rory Gallagher. He died 25 years ago. An amazing blues guitarist from Ireland. So it is now late 1966. Around Christmas time, Jimmy in England goes to have Christmas dinner with Noel Redding, his bass player, at his mother's house. There's a dog sitting by the fire. And from this, we get the song Fire. And we also get Jimi Hendrix saying in at least one song, "Move over, Rover, and let Jimmy take over." A line you can use at your convenience. Now we move into 1967. So it's England. America has no idea who Hendrix is. Hendrix is working on his albums. He's playing France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Luxembourg. And on March 31, 1967, the first UK tour starts with Jimi and the Jimi Hendrix Experience with the three guys, and that goes on until April 30th. On May 29th, there was a concert called The Barbecue, where we all wish we were, because Hendrix played, and Cream, and Pink Floyd, and The Move, and Zoot Money. Too bad we were not there in '67. Later on in June of '67, because he's on his way to Monterey Pop, so he's back in America, he goes and sees Richie Havens, who was the opening act at Woodstock. Those of you who took my Woodstock class know that. And sees Richie Havens and sees the Doors just before going to Monterey Pop. So let's talk about Monterey Pop. Monterey Pop, Hendrix played on June 18th, 1967. The rumor is that nobody got paid at all at Monterey Pop, or that only Hendrix got paid. The only person who got paid, because I went to a lecture at the Academy, downtown LA, the Grammy Museum in LA, and Lou Adler spoke and before and after Monterey Pop was played. Monterey Pop is a phenomenal film. And he said that Ravi Shankar was the only one who got paid. So whatever you might read, let's take it from Lou Adler's mouth, because Lou Adler was one of the producers, along with John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Another interesting side note, there's a Mamas and the Papas album where I believe they're all in the bathtub. Should have been in Laurel Canyon. Most photography by Henry Diltz, a very nice guy. Hi, Henry. And on the album cover of Mamas and the Papas, there's an apostrophe in Papas, which, as you all know, there should not be any apostrophe in the plural case. So, Monterey Pop. There's an argument between The Who were known for destroying instruments, and Hendrix, who occasionally would destroy an instrument on stage. The first time Jimi destroyed an instrument was in Germany, when someone dragged him off the stage, and to get back on the stage, Hendrix threw his guitar ahead of him, and it smashed a little bit, and Hendrix went, "What the hell?" and just smashed the rest of his guitar, to which a publicist said, "That's a cool thing to do." So at Monterey Pop, that guy, Paul McCartney, who was also on the board of directors, told Lou Adler and John Phillips, "Get this Jimi Hendrix guy that you've never heard of. We've seen him, I've seen him, I like him." So they brought Jimi Hendrix out to play at Monterey. If you have not seen the footage of Monterey Pop, please do. It is stunning, and we'll see that soon. We will be watching, soon be watching Monterey Pop. This is where Jimi Hendrix burned his guitar famously. And the audience didn't know what to expect. They'd never heard of Jimi Hendrix. So it's some guys playing. It's like you seeing the Nas. You've never heard of the Nas, and there they are. So here's this guy, probably on 2 hits of acid, maybe not. And but speaking of acid, let us not forget that when Santana was playing at Woodstock, he was on mescaline, and the neck of his guitar was a snake he was wrestling. So ponder that next time you watch Soul Sacrifice by Santana at Woodstock. So there was a debate backstage between The Who and Jimi Hendrix, because they knew each other, about, well, I'm not going to follow you. Well, I'm not going to follow you. So the coin is flipped. The Who win, so they're going first. Luckily, the Grateful Dead were between the two bands to give a little bit of a breather. And then Jimi Hendrix comes out. And when The Who won the coin toss, Hendrix jumped up on a chair, just did some really lightning fast riff, and The Who knew they were going to lose, but at least they didn't want to follow Hendrix. Hendrix also, Pete Townsend, the lead singer of The Who, or the lead guitarist of The Who, also said that Hendrix was stronger than LSD. I've never done LSD, but lots of these guys did. So that's a Townsend quote about Hendrix. So now we're going to watch Jimi Hendrix set his guitar on fire to an audience that's never heard of him. Let's do the fire part. What else do we have? Let's just go to the fire part, because oh man, come on, that was And the looks of those people, and in the movie, there are even more people like Mama Cass going, they had no idea. And one of the photographers, of the still photographers there, was a newcomer to shooting. Ed Karif, I believe is his name. And one of the other more seasoned journalists said, because Ed was running out of film, and the guy said to Ed, save some pictures because you're going to want to see this guy burn his guitar. So with that good advice, some of the best still pictures of Jimi burning his guitar from the front row were taken by Ed Karif. So I hope you guys love that because it's stunning. So it's in the Monterey Pop film. Where to now? So with that, he was famous. People say, oh, that started it, but it's not true, because 2 nights later, he started a 5-night run at the Fillmore Auditorium in San Francisco, 2 sets a night. So that is a lot of exhaustion to be playing 2 sets a night for 5 nights. Then in July, he was playing at the Whiskey A Go-Go in LA. And then in July of '67, playing with, come on, what heavy metal would you hook him up with? You'd hook him up with the Monkees, because you didn't know what you were doing. So he was paired up with the Monkees and a few other bands, and this did not go over well, as you can imagine. So the management put out a fake news, can you imagine fake news, press release saying that the Daughters of the American Revolution were protesting Jimi Hendrix's experience because it was surely unwholesome for young white girls. So with that sham excuse, the Hendrix, his experience, got off of the Hollywood, the Monkees tour. They played later on at the Bull with the Mamas and the Papas, also to quite a lot of stunned silence. They played in Santa Barbara with Moby Grape, which was a far better billing. And they played on November 11th in England with 10 years after, who were also at Woodstock opening. 10 years after, got paid £60. The Experience got paid £500. And by the time '68 rolls around, which is in about 3 sentences, the Jimi Hendrix Experience was becoming the highest paid band in America. In December of '67, their second album, Axis Bold as Love, was released in England, and soon thereafter in America. And in December in England, there was a Christmas concert with, again, Jimi Hendrix, The Who, Pink Floyd, Soft Machine, Traffic, and Graham Bond. Oh, sorry, yeah, sorry, not from Lexus Corner, from Graham Bond. That's the band that had Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce and John McLaughlin, who then wound up playing with Miles Davis, as you all know. All right, so now we're 1968. So in San Francisco, he's playing in February with Winterland with Albert King, the blues musician, and with John Mayall, John Mayall at various times had Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and Jeff Beck. In March, he played Clark University in Worcester, Mass. That was recorded and filmed. Back in April of '68, he's in New York City, and he's jamming with people like B.B. King and Elvin Bishop and Al Cooper. Al Cooper, who I also saw perform. Al Cooper played keyboards with Bob Dylan at the Newport Folk Festival when he got booed off stage for going electric, and Paul Butterfield, and even Ted Nugent till 6 a.m. May of '68, they played at the Miami Pop Festival, which was basically hell, just a total rained out, horrible, basically a Woodstock, except fewer people, of chaos and badness and rain, with the Mothers of Invention, Blue Cheer, and John Lee Hooker. So in the limo leaving the Miami Pop Festival, it's raining, and Jimmy starts writing the lyrics to Still Raining, Still Dreaming in the car. In New York in June, Jimmy's jamming with Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck. If only that would have been recorded, that would have been a million seller. Blues guitarist Larry Coryell. So Larry Coryell decides to show his blues chops and does 10 minutes of really fancy stuff going, I can play jazz. And in fact, Jimmy, besides dropping out of high school, never learned to read music. And it was one of his goals to learn, like he wanted to take a year off and learn classical, not classical music, but be trained in music, be able to compose and lead an orchestra. This in the final months of Jimmy's life were what he wanted to do. His goal was to really get into the creative side of music and integrate with, jazz and other top-notch musicians from various genres. So in the story that I was reading, so Larry Coryell, a famous jazz musician, does 10 minutes of fancy footwork, Hendrixy, flashy stuff, and Hendrix comes on stage and just does one, and as the book says, the last 10 minutes of Larry Coryell were immediately forgotten by everyone because Hendrix clearly was much better. And Coryell said, well, I guess I got to go back to learning my basics after that, because not the guy to try to show up. So in September 18th of 68 at the Whiskey A Go-Go in Los Angeles, Hendrix joins Buddy Miles, who would be his drummer on the Band of Gypsies album, and Eric Burdon and Graham Bond. He joins them on stage. And in 1969, he's invited to be on the Lulu show in the United Kingdom, where he is told, okay, you have like 3 minutes for this and 2.5 minutes for that, and then we're going to do the final closing on the show and do the credits. Hendrix ignores this and just keeps playing for the end of the thing and is told, you'll never play in this town again. So much for Jimi and Lulu. Then they're playing in the experience is playing in Sweden, Denmark, France, Austria, Germany, UK. In February of 69, Van de Graaff Generator, another band some of you might be interested in finding out about, Van de Graaff Generator opens for them. Who makes these names up? He's playing with Rahsaan Roland Kirk. He's playing with John McLaughlin, and there is in fact a recording of John McLaughlin on YouTube, of John McLaughlin, famous guitarist, with Miles Davis and lots of other people playing with Jimi Hendrix, and it's pretty darn good. Then also in 1969, in June of 69, I could have been there, but I left early because I was a kid, at the LA Teenage Fair, where the MC5 and Dr. John and the Flying Burrito Brothers and Sir Douglas Quintet and Delaney and Bonnie played sets. Jimi Hendrix goes up on stage unannounced to join and jam a little bit with Delaney and Bonnie. Oh man, well, too bad none of us were there. In June 69, in Devonshire Downs, which is Northridge, the Valley of Los Angeles, there is the Newport Pop Festival with 10 Years After and just countless other top-notch bands playing. The Black Panthers are there and they're talking to Jimi, and Jimi was not political. Also, Woodstock was not political. Abby Hoffman went on stage at Woodstock during the Who's concert, not a smart move, and Pete Townsend hits him with his guitar and knocks Abby Hoffman off stage, which is the last time anybody saw Abby Hoffman at Woodstock, at least anybody that reported seeing him. So the Black Panthers are talking with Jimi behind the stage, and they're against Martin Luther King, who had already died at this time, but they're giving him political rhetoric, and Jimi spoke through his music. It was Electric Church. If he had something to say, he said it through his music. And so Jimi gave a lousy performance, and I watched it recently because that's on YouTube. I am glad I did not go 2 hours by bus. It was a bad concert. And Mitch Mitchell, the drummer, said of this, quote, one of the lowest points in the band's history. So now we are in the middle of 69, and then they go to the Denver Pop Festival, which had Zappa, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Johnny Winter, Big Mama Thornton, who's the woman who wrote Hound Dog that Elvis stole from her without giving credit, I believe. But let's just say Big Mama Thornton died in poverty and Elvis did not. And that concert and that event was so lousy that Noel Redding left or was pushed from the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Then we get to Woodstock. Actually, where are we at the time? Let's go play some Woodstock. So Hendrix played at 8 in the morning. So this was the last, in fact, Woodstock was Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And as you know, lots of rain and no food and no fights. And one person died, but he was run over accidentally by a truck, and no baby was born according to any records, even though it was believed so, but not the case, just more trivia. So so he plays the 8 a.m. shift after Sha Na Na. because it's finally daylight. And most people had left, of the 500,000 or so, they left Woodstock, but some were still left. And so at 8 in the morning, after a few other songs, Jimi plays the Star Spangled Banner. And here's the end of all the reports of Jimi, with the exception of occasional relationship squabbles, that he was a humble, polite, shy guy. Like if anyone said, can you do this or do that, other than apparently the Panthers at Newport, he would say yes, or he would, because it wasn't worth the effort for him to get into an argument. So he just was a really, really sweet guy, and he helped people, you know, no ego problem with him. But then again, apparently eating LSD helps you get rid of your ego. So A+ on that one. So after that, we have Woodstock. And another thing that I found in one of the books, the band playing at Woodstock, in one of the books I'm reading, it was called Gypsy Suns and Rainbows, SONS. But according to the official Jimi Hendrix website, it's Gypsy Sun, SUN, and Rainbows. So more conflict, and hopefully I have found the truth. So Woodstock was August 18th, 69. And in October, he ended that band and moved on to his new band called Band of Gypsies. So Band of Gypsies was the first all-black band that Jimi had played with Buddy Miles on drums and his army buddy, Billy Cox, on bass. So we're gonna cut forward to that. We'll cut forward to Band of Gypsies, which was a contractual, just they had to do another album to get out of a contract dispute. And he had many a contract dispute that I haven't even touched on. That's a whole other class of Jimi and contract disputes. I haven't even talked about his manager, which if I don't talk about his manager, that is okay too, who took 40% of Jimi's profits in a contract. Like, that's quite the contract. So New Year's Eve, playing at the Fillmore East, for maybe it was drugs, maybe not, but Jimi was shivering New Year's Eve on stage and sat on the drum chair and then left. But the next day, January 1st, 1970, Band of Gypsies. So get out your lyric sheet, and we're going to listen to Machine Gun. So Machine Gun is one of my favorite song of all Jimi Hendrix songs is Voodoo Child Slight Return. I just consider it, for various reasons, the best song ever. It resonates with me. So Voodoo Child is the song, my favorite song in the universe, and I've got tens of thousands of songs in my head. But as far as another great Hendrix song is Machine Gun, which, like Star Spangled Banner, is a war or anti-war song. So here is some of Machine Gun, where Hendrix is making his guitar sound like, and the drums sounding like rat-a-tat-tat of machine gun and bombs bursting. Let's do the black and white version, sure. No, with the one with the color, with the overlay. Let's do the color one then, please. So we'll be there in a second. And big round of applause to Kathleen, my tech assistant, without whom I would not be possible. Thanks. So one of the lyrics in that song is Machine Gun, people, man, make me kill you. People, man, make me kill you, even though we're only families apart. It's, you know, some of you know the music and know the song, and you're feeling the emotion that I'm feeling. And I didn't play the lyrics, but you've got a lyric sheet and you can find it. But part of the class is the lyrics and part of the class, and I'm thinking maybe I need a 4-hour class. I've never taught this before, so thanks for knowing I'm certainly doing my best. And apparently I have 20 hours of material. But I hope you enjoyed that, because his guitar virtuosity is crucial. What else do we have on video that's handy? What else? On videos, okay. Let's do, we have, pardon me? Name one.
Wing, EXP, castles,
Oh, yeah, let's play Castles Made of Sand. Let me wrap up, let me do a little bit more here. And I'm happy to go to 4. I respect that the class said it's 2 hours, but okay, yes. So I quickly bounced through a bit more. So that was Band of Gypsies. So that was New Year's Eve and New Year's Day of 1970. In September 6th, he played the Love and Peace Festival at the Isle of Fehmarn in Germany, which had bikers and rain and Not Worth Listening To. And that was the last Jimi Hendrix concert. And on September 18th in London, he overdosed. And he overdosed on sleeping pills and some wine. His pallbearers included Eric Burden and Johnny Winter. And because time's running out, let's do the song that I think has, so grab your lyric sheet for Castles Made of Sand. Verse 2 has to do with his brother Leon when they would play war games in the woods with his Indian friends, when they play cowboys and Indians. And verse 3 is about his mother in the wheelchair. And the verse 3 brings tears to my eyes. So Castles Made of Sand by Jimi.